Okay, so welcome everybody to this talk about smoking and mortality in Australia. I usually start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, but I'm not really sure how to do that, so I think I would just say generally acknowledging the custodians of the land that I'm at and that you're at, and the airwaves in between. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. So when I tell people that I've been researching smoking and mortality, the general response is, but it says it on the packet. Why would anybody look at smoking and mortality? We know very well that smoking increases the risk of premature death. But I'm going to take you through this talk, and I hope by the end of this talk you'll understand why it's important not only to look at it in detail, but to look at it for each population and to understand the magnitude of the effect. So in terms of the plan of this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of background on smoking and health. I'm going to then talk about our primary sort of data or direct data from Australia in terms of smoking and mortality. I'll compare those findings to the international findings, and then I'll talk about the implications of the findings. So Goethe says that thinking is easy and acting is difficult, and putting one's thoughts into action is the most difficult thing in the world. And I think this is of particular relevance to us as public health practitioners, because we are not only expected to think, we are really also expected to act. And one of the other things that Goethe didn't say was that if you do something that actually works, then you are actually likely to come in for quite a lot of flack. So it's particularly hard to do things that work. And Australia's been a world leader in tobacco control, but it's also being taken to court internationally for those effective tactics. So in terms of going on with the fact that it says it on the packet, the fact that tobacco adversely affects health is well established, and we've known for decades about its effects across multiple parts of the body. But what we haven't had a firm grasp on is from different epidemic to epidemic within each country, what the magnitude of each effect is. And what we do know is that the effects of tobacco on health vary over time, and I'll go into further detail about that, and they vary according to the population you're looking at. So it's very, very important to have local evidence to guide policy, for example, within Australia, but also because of Australia's unique setting, those findings from Australia can make a contribution to the international evidence. Just looking at global smoking, we have around 1 billion people in the world who are daily smokers, aged 15 years and over. They're predominantly men, so 820 million men in Australia, in the world, are estimated to smoke. And that's actually about 1/3 of the male population on the planet. We have around 176 million women who smoke, and that's around 7% of women. And these are not light smokers. Generally, the smoking is around 15 cigarettes per day. So if you look at the age standardised smoking prevalence among men, and the bottom part of the world map, the bottom world map is for women, the red areas represent the areas of higher smoking prevalence, and the blue areas represent those of lower prevalence. And what you can see is that overall smoking prevalence is lower in women than in men, and there are particular areas of concentrated high prevalence of smoking. So if you look particularly Europe, Eastern Europe, Russia, and also Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, so areas actually close to Australia. We also have pockets in South America. And you can see that actually there's a lot of variation between men and women, particularly in Asia, and that Australia's there in the sort of mid-range. What we can see from this next graph, which is from Tobacco Atlas from 2015, is really where a lot of the concern is. So you can see that there's been fantastic progress in terms of trillions of cigarettes per year in Europe. These aren't absolutely massive, but particularly in the Americas and in the Western Pacific. But what you can also see is that the increase in smoking in China pretty much dwarfs all of our other progress. The average Chinese smoker smokes around 22 cigarettes per day. We're talking about around 60 to 70% of adult Chinese men smoke. And the actual consumption of tobacco in China is greater than all of the other low middle income countries combined. If we then look at the burden of disease caused by tobacco smoking, this is just an excerpt from the Lancet paper from 2012 on that. We estimate that there are around 6.3 million deaths per year from smoking, and the loss of around 157 million dailies. And that takes it to being pretty much it's the second cause of burden of disease after high blood pressure worldwide. But it's also responsible for over 10% of all of the deaths worldwide. So that 6.3 million deaths, it converts to 17,000 deaths every single day from tobacco. And we estimate that there are around 100 million deaths from tobacco in the 20th century. And we estimate that there will be around 1 billion deaths in the 21st century. Now, I think this is a really damning statistic because you can sort of excuse a certain amount of the excess death toll during the 20th century because we didn't actually know what the health effects of tobacco were. We know what the health effects of tobacco are now, and yet we're seeing this massive death toll. It's arguably the leading readily preventable cause of excess mortality. What we also see is if you look globally, that smoking is increasingly concentrated in the poor. And if you look within developed nations, it's increasingly concentrated in the poor and the mentally ill. So in countries where we have had successful tobacco control, we see this increasing inequality. So the other thing to note is that it's getting worse. So although we can really be very proud of our progress in tobacco control, you can see from those figures that we're actually expecting that 10% of deaths worldwide caused by tobacco to increase. If we look at these diseases that are actually caused by tobacco, so this is also from the Global Burden of Disease Estimates, and that second line is tobacco smoking, and the colours represent the different conditions that are responsible for the excess disability adjusted life years lost. And what you can see is that for tobacco, it is spread across cancer, which is the dark blue, cardiovascular disease, and chronic respiratory disease. Those are the three main ones, but there are some other conditions at the other end, including other non-communicable diseases and lower respiratory infections. But essentially, the excess mortality and loss of disability adjusted life years is related to those three main things of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and chronic respiratory disease. So just moving on now to talk about the sort of why it's important to have data relevant to a particular time and place. And this is to do with the documented stages of the cigarette epidemic. So if you imagine stage 1, which is really where sub-Saharan Africa is at the moment, there's actually low prevalence of smoking. So the solid lines represent the proportion of the population who are smokers, and those sort of hashed lines, and the ones with the sort of stripy bits on them, are the percentages of male deaths and female deaths caused by smoking. And what you can see is that the proportion of male smokers goes up, it's followed by the proportion of female smokers going up, and then you see a lag, but an increase in the gradually increasing proportion of male deaths that are attributable to smoking, and then proportion of female deaths. What is quite interesting is this presumes that the proportion of female and proportion of male smokers will tend to converge. What we're seeing in a lot of Asian countries is actually proportions of female smokers remaining quite low, although I'm sure it's an area of interest to tobacco companies. But it seems that the cultural pressures that prevent women smoking are quite strong. But in any case, there tends to be this progression through the cigarette epidemic. And what we can see is in this stage 4 of the epidemic is reducing prevalence of female and male smokers, similar prevalences of smoking among men and women, and this peaking of the proportion of male deaths, increasing female deaths, and then the actual male deaths starting to go down. So Australia is in this stage 4 of the epidemic. It actually has a lower prevalence of smoking than most of those other Western countries. So it's in a unique position to give information about what happens at that stage of the epidemic. It also is the stage where the full hazards of smoking are being realised, because during the stage 4 of the epidemic, the smokers themselves commenced smoking at quite a young age and smoked heavily throughout their lives. So actually, it's also a time where we see quite high relative risks of excess mortality associated with smoking. So moving on to direct data from Australia, this is a wonderful graph, and it's particularly satisfying to present this at international meetings because it really highlights this extraordinary success that Australia's had. What we can see here is the prevalence of smoking in Australia according to calendar year. And we're now down in the most recent survey at around 12.8% current daily smoking. So what we see in this graph here is the prevalence of smoking overall, and it's a bit of a mixture between current daily and less than weekly, but more or less it's actually current daily smoking. We also see pictures of so-called plain packaging and some information about the costs of smoking in Australia. But what we can see there is a really rapid decline. For men, the smoking prevalence peaked probably in the 1940s, and for the women it peaked in 1978. So slightly different epidemics in men and women. Even though we've had this success, we know that there are actually around 2.7 million smokers in Australia. So, and we also know that there are particularly high rates of smoking among the disadvantaged and mentally ill, and particularly among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. One of the things that is also useful to present is how successful Australia is overall in public health terms. So, and the reductions in smoking are likely to have contributed substantially to this. So this is a graph of the death rates in 5 different countries in the age group 35 to 69. Now this is the age group that we look at for, it's a sort of a sentinel age group for looking at premature mortality. It's more sensitive than overall life expectancy, because overall life expectancy is influenced by infant mortality, but it's also influenced by deaths at older ages. And it's a sort of estimate of the life expectancy of someone who was born now, whereas this gives us quite an acute view of the premature mortality internationally. And you can see that the Australian graph, the Australian line is the green one. And what is amazing about that, and what most people don't know, is that in men aged 35 to 69, there's only one country in the world that's actually doing better than Australia, and that's Iceland. Our premature mortality rates in men became better than Japan in the late 1990s and have continued at that level. For women in Japan are still doing better than women in Australia, but Australia's doing much better than a lot of the other countries. As I've said, there are multiple factors that are likely to contribute to this, but that stark decline is largely attributable to reductions in cardiovascular disease, and those reductions are likely to be the result, first of all, of better treatment of acute cardiovascular events and also better prevention, particularly control of blood pressure, but also reductions in smoking and improvements in treatments for lipid levels. So this is our big public health triumph, and in many ways we're not exactly sure of the exact quantitative contribution of the different factors to that, and it is sometimes referred to as a poorly understood triumph. But nonetheless, it really underpins the importance of smoking cessation in Australia. And if we consider we've still got 2.7 million smokers, we've still got a bit of a way to go. So the aim of the study that I want to present to you today, the primary data on, was to investigate the relationship of smoking to all-cause mortality in Australia in the 45 and up study cohort. The methods of the 45 and up study cohort are outlined here. We followed around 267,000 participants who were recruited between 2006 and 2009, and they were from New South Wales in Australia. They were aged 45 to over 100, and they were from a general population sampling frame. They're actually sampled through the Medicare Australia database. All of the participants completed a self-administered baseline questionnaire. We had an 18% response rate, which ultimately meant that we have around 10% of the New South Wales population aged 45 and over in the study. They gave consent for linkage to health records, including deaths. Oh, and the other thing I should just note now is that representativeness is not necessary for the estimates which we are producing here. So I know that people often, when they see an 18% response rate, they're concerned that the study is not representative. And that certainly would be an issue if we were commenting on the point prevalence of things within the survey. But what we're actually doing in this survey, in this particular analysis, is comparing the relative risk of mortality in current smokers and never smokers and past smokers within the cohort. So representativeness is not necessary. And if you consider one of the major sources of data for this for smoking estimates has been the British Doctors Study, you'll appreciate that they're definitely not representative of the general population. Within that framework and the study infrastructure, we conducted a cohort analysis of 45 and up study participants. We excluded those who were missing data on smoking and those who had self-reported cancer or heart disease or stroke at baseline. And that was in order to avoid biases relating to the sick quitter effect. We followed people up for deaths via the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages to mid-2012. The ascertainment of tobacco smoking was from the baseline questionnaire, and this is the question here, which is, have you ever been a regular smoker, yes or no? How old were you when you started smoking regularly? Are you a regular smoker now? If no, how old were you when you stopped smoking regularly? And then there were the number of cigarettes per day. Now this question is brief. There are quite a number of other types of questions that you can ask about smoking behaviour. They often start with, have you ever smoked 100 cigarettes or more in your lifetime? And they move on through a lot of things. The 45 and up study was sent to a large number of people and it had to be very brief. So this question was devised with the assistance of Richard Pito and Valerie Beryl and is actually similar to the one used in the Million Women study. This is the overall study design. So people completed the baseline survey from January 2006 to April 2009, and then we have linked death data from 2006 to 2012. We also linked to hospitalisation data backwards, so in the period leading up to completing the questionnaire, in order to do some sensitivity analyses relating to previous respiratory illness. We used Cox proportional hazards modelling with age as the underlying time variable, and we adjusted for a range of factors that might potentially confound the relationship of smoking to the outcome of all-cause mortality. We performed a survival analysis as well, and then we looked at men and women separately, and we also looked according to year of birth or group, so that we could look at those stages in the tobacco epidemic. And we conducted sensitivity analyses, which included broadening the classification of current smokers, so including current and recent smokers, also excluding people who had hospital admissions for respiratory illness, and we also looked at adjusting further for physical activity. I will be reporting on those. We have, after those exclusions, a bit over 200,000 participants who contributed 874,000 person years over a 4.3 mean follow-up years of mean follow-up time. There were 5,600 deaths in the cohort. And what you can see in the graph is actually the low proportion of people within the cohort who were current smokers. And that actually was, so we had around 8% of the cohort being current smokers. Around 12% of the New South Wales population aged 45 and over at that time were current smokers. So what we see there is essentially what we call the healthy cohort effect, which is that people who join a cohort study are generally less likely to engage in behaviours that are harmful to their health, and they're generally healthier than the mainstream. But as I said before, we're actually comparing people within the cohort who are all affected by that cohort effect to a similar extent. So this is the main finding here, which is the main slide, which is the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality in current and past smokers relative to never smokers. So you can see in the forest plot that the vertical line is the line of no effect, and that's the reference group of people who have never smoked. For men, what you can see, first of all, I draw your attention to the rate of death, the death rate, and you can see from that men actually have much higher death rates than women. But what you can also see is when you look at the adjusted relative risk of death in smokers versus current smokers versus never smokers, that current smokers had a relative risk of death during that period of 2.82 compared to never smokers, and the women it was 3.08. And in fact, those estimates don't differ significantly between men and women. So we ended up with a relative risk of around 3 for current versus never smokers during the follow-up period. And the relative risk in former smokers was 1.3 to 1.5. If we look at it, and I don't expect you to look in detail at this slide, but really what this shows was those same people but divided according to birth decade. And just the idea here is to just look broadly at the pattern. And what it actually shows is that, in fact, comparing people who were current versus never smokers, looking at people born in the 1920s, 30s, 40s and 50s, there aren't really much differences in that overall relative risk, suggesting that Australia actually has a stable epidemic in relation to smoking, that those risks, those excess mortality risks, have actually stabilised to some extent in Australia. If we look at the age-standardised rates of all-cause mortality in current smokers and never smokers by smoking intensity, so the number of cigarettes per day is on the bottom, and we've actually plotted those according to the median number of cigarettes smoked actually among a sample at follow-up to avoid regression dilution bias. Happy to go into that technical detail if anyone wants to talk offline about that. But what you can see here is the increase in the mortality rate according to the intensity of smoking. And what we found was there was around a doubling in the risk of death in those who smoked a median of 10 cigarettes a day. So that's actually the group who smoke fewer than 15 cigarettes a day, and around a 4 to 5-fold increase in the risk of mortality in those smoking 25 or more cigarettes a day. So this is quite an important message. I think there are lots of people out there in that group who smoke fewer than 15 cigarettes a day, you know, those who smoke 5 cigarettes a day or 10 cigarettes a day, who think, well, I'm just a light smoker. It's not going to increase my risk of disease very much. But in fact, a doubling in your risk of mortality is equivalent to being morbidly obese or drinking a bottle of vodka a day. So in terms of your overall mortality risk. So it's actually really, I think, highlights what a potent risk factor smoking is. If we look at the good news here, which is that if you cease smoking by the age of 45, so this shows the relative risk of mortality in never smokers as 1, current smokers is that dotted line up the top, that's that 3-fold increase in risk. And what you can see is that if you cease smoking by the age of 45, there's no significant difference in your overall mortality risk compared to someone who has never smoked. We still have a bit of an elevation in risk in those who ceased between the age of 45 and 55. However, they're still better off than people who are continuing to smoke. So what it says is that it's important to cease smoking, whatever age you are, and the earlier the better. We're unable to look in people over the age of 55, basically because there's a thing called the sick quitter effect. So we can't, once we get over 55, often people are quitting because they're ill, and so you tend to overestimate the death rates in the people who've quit. So we tend to draw the line at 55. This then is a sort of hypothetical of taking those relative risk estimates and applying them to the life expectancy of the general Australian population. We have men on the left and women on the right. And the bottom line is the cumulative risk of death, a percentage in the non-smokers, and the upper line is the cumulative risk of death in the smokers. So if you look in the men, you can see that by age 75, around 19% of non-smokers have died, and what you see is that around 45% of the smokers would be estimated to have died, and they lose a mean of around 10 years of life. And you see a similar picture in the women, although their absolute mortality rates are slightly lower. So around a third of smokers will be dead, and 12% of those who've never smoked, or non-smokers, will be dead, but still a 10-year loss in average life expectancy. So we don't know from these data, because we didn't have access to cause of death data at the time when we did the analyses. We know that there is this excess risk of death in the smokers versus the non-smokers. We don't know exactly what those deaths were due to, but we know from previous studies that that smoking causes a huge number of different diseases, and that excess risk of mortality in the smokers is largely due to smoking-related illness. So if you look at these data here, which are from the Men and Women study, you can see sort of a picture of all the different parts of the body that are affected by smoking, and then you can see the relative risks. So for chronic lung disease, there's a relative risk around 35 for deaths from that, cancer of the lung, peripheral vascular disease, other kinds of cancer, coronary heart disease. You can see that there are very large relative risks there. And so we can assume from that that the excess risk that we observe of mortality in the smokers compared to non-smokers is largely because of smoking. There are some conditions which are increased in smokers which may be to do with more general risk-taking behaviour, so increases in homicides, increases in injuries, and when we now are analysing the data where we have cause of death. We've recently acquired those data, and we will be looking at more closely. But those diseases which are increased in smokers but are not necessarily due to smoking are actually make up quite a small proportion of the deaths. So we can assume that the excess mortality in smokers is due to smoking largely. So the conclusions from these direct Australian data are, first of all, that we have a low prevalence of smoking, that the risk of dying during follow-up in current smokers is around 3-fold, 3 times that of never smokers. And from that, we can calculate a population attributable fraction, which is up to 2/3 of deaths in smokers can be attributed to smoking. That means around 1.8 million of the 2.7 million current smokers in Australia would be expected to die of their habit if they don't quit. Now, this 2/3 figure is actually greater than the previous estimates, because in Australia we were generally using estimates that were sort of average of the rest of the world, and we had that around half of all deaths were attributed to smoking. So what we're seeing here is a greater hazard than we had previously thought. But with that greater hazard also comes a finding that the benefits of quitting are greater. And what we find is that the earlier the better. And there's around a 10-year estimated average reduction in life expectancy. So if we compare that with international data, as I've said, there is a variation in the mortality relative risk between countries and over time, and that's influenced by a variety of factors. First of all, it's influenced by the smoking patterns, or indeed the stage in the tobacco epidemic that the population is at. So in countries where people have only started smoking relatively recently, and they tend to start at older ages and they don't smoke as heavily, you won't observe the same relative risks. The other thing is that in countries which have high death rates in the never smokers, you tend to see less of an effect of smoking because there's a sort of smaller gap, and that's also seen over time. So I put this slide of the stages in the cigarette epidemic, but you can see there that if you imagine a scenario where you're in one of those countries which is kind of on the upswing, you won't have had enough time for that lagged increase in deaths to have occurred to the extent that it has in countries which are in stage 4 of the epidemic. And I think this is illustrated extremely nicely by findings from Professor Sir Richard Dole and colleagues in Oxford looking at the British doctors study. What you can see here is the findings according to study decade, and what you can see is the death rates in the lifelong non-smokers, the death rates in the cigarette smokers over those decades. And the first thing to note is that the death rates in the average lifelong non-smokers have actually halved from the 1950s to the late 20th century. The death rates in the cigarette smokers have actually increased. And so what you see is the ratio of those rates, or the relative risk, changed from being around 1.2 in the 50s to around 2 in the 1980s, to this figure now, which is around 2.83. So when we compare our contemporary findings with those of other countries who really have a similar stage in the epidemic, so I've put here findings from the US and the UK. What you can see is Richard Dole's finding there of the 2.83 that I just showed you, findings from the US from N. Haynes and other cohorts, and the American Cancer Society, 2.8, and Tunedal 2.8. And our findings, I have to say, line up absolutely perfectly with the British doctors study. So that was a pretty exciting moment in the analysis. It's funny because I think often as scientists we get excited that we found something completely new. And obviously these were new findings from Australia. No one had ever shown them before. But I have to say it sent a real tingle through me to have a finding that lined up so perfectly with the data from other contemporary epidemics. We can see for women that we're also looking at a relative risk of around 2.8 to 3. And those attributable fractions, around 2/3 of deaths attributable to smoking in those different places. We also, if we put together their different survival curves for those places, we also find a similar estimate of number of average years of life lost, which is around 10 or 11 years. So that also lines up very well. So this means that if we're thinking about the way that smoking risks have evolved, In the 1960s, around 1 in 6 smokers could be expected to die of their habit, and that was sort of like rolling a dice. In the 1980s, around half of all smokers could be expected to die of their habit. It was kind of like tossing a coin. And I've been trying to think about the terms to use for this most recent stuff, which is that around 2/3 of all smokers will die of their habit in Australia. And I think we're at the point to say, well, actually, house wins, so it's really time to stop gambling. And moving now to say, well, why does it matter to move from saying, well, about half of all smokers to 2/3 of all smokers will be killed by their habit? Why does that matter? And I mean, I can understand people asking that because there really are very few other things that we do that will kill half of all people. You know, it's certainly not skydiving. I don't know about base jumping, but anyway, there are very few things that actually will kill half of all the people who do it. And why does it matter that we're now up to 2/3? Well, the first thing to say is that there is a lot of sort of thought and emphasis placed on the balance of probabilities. You particularly see this in civil law. So if you have something an exposure which is more likely than not to have killed somebody, that actually is enough often to win a civil case in law. But it's also about how people perceive the risk. So I've had conversations with people who staff the quit line, and they now use these findings, and they say it makes quite a big difference to say to someone, well, 50-50 chance it's going to kill you, to say, well, actually, odds on, it'll get you if you keep on going. So it does make a difference to the way that those harms are perceived. The other thing is that the benefits of quitting are framed differently. So it does actually mean if you can convince one person to quit, or if you quit, the chances are you've saved a life. So that's actually shifting that balance of probability. So I think I would argue that my impression, particularly from policymakers and people at the front line, is that it does matter to have that shift in probabilities. So how did we get here? I think it's an important question, like why have we gotten to this point worldwide with this completely avoidable exposure? Well, the first thing is that smoking is highly addictive. I think all of us will know people who've managed to quit much more sort of feared kinds of drug addiction, like heroin addiction, but haven't managed to quit smoking. It's a highly addictive habit, and it often takes people multiple attempts to quit. The other thing is that cigarettes were introduced into our sort of regulatory system at a time when there was an ignorance about what they did. So they were grandfathered into the sort of FDA in 1915 before we really knew what they did. And if you imagine the fuss that's created when there's a drug that might have side effects that result in death, I mean, if you imagine a drug that you put on the market that would kill 2/3 of the long-term users, I think you would have a lot of difficulties getting that drug registered. I mean, if you framed it as, well, I've got this thing, people will generally start using it when they're children. By the time they're in a position to make an informed decision about their health, they'll be highly addicted. It does seem to be socially important in some settings, and it might have some stress-relieving properties, but then it might not. But it will kill 2/3 of people do it. I think you'd have a lot of problems getting it licensed. And if you also think about the sort of product recall on, say, a car with a faulty clutch, well, this is actually a product which by design does that. It will kill people. So there are issues with the regulation of tobacco. But the other thing is it does speak to our underlying priorities, and you particularly see this on the world stage. We have in effect said that people's right to trade and make a profit is more important than people's health. That is essentially what we have said within our system. And I think that that's an important point to have a dialogue about. These advertisements here are actually from the time before we knew that smoking was harmful. So you can see here, one of the things I think is really extraordinary is this baby looking up at this mother saying, "Before you scold me, Mum, maybe you'd better light up a Marlboro." So the way that things were framed and what we knew about them has really changed. The other thing is that the tobacco companies have the most extraordinary amount of money. So I've just put here a photo of the Point Piper residence of the former CEO of Philip Morris in Australia. So this is just Australia. It's not a big market. And that was expected to fetch $47 million at auction. So the actual amount of money that these companies have, not only to pay their executives, but also to influence sort of politicians and policies within different countries is extraordinary. And if you, okay, I've gone a bit further forward, but if you look at the health warnings on the US tobacco pack, so basically there's no graphic health warning, there's no picture, there's just some gold, or if you look at the Marlboro packet, for example, there's just gold writing on a white background, it's obviously very hard to see. And one of the ones I looked at just said cigarette smoke contains carbon monoxide. So that's not, to me, a very powerful health warning because sort of, you know, atmospheric air contains carbon monoxide. So the tobacco lobby, because, you know, is very, very powerful in lots of countries. And you can really see differences in the ability to put health warnings on tobacco packets according to that. So there are lots of different reasons why I've gotten here. So in terms of the use of these findings, I was very keen when we released the findings that it wouldn't just be here's a paper and just sort of have it released as a research finding, that this is really only useful as a public health tool. And it's part of a much broader, much longer effort that Australia's been a world leader in. But it is true also that, you know, in terms of public health, that the release of these findings themselves is a public health action. So it took a large amount of planning, and the paper itself was conceived and involved partner organisations from the very outset. So there are authors from the Cancer Council and Heart Foundation on the paper. We have liaison with New South Wales Ministry of Health. And we also had early consultation with real key players in tobacco control in Australia, including Mike Daub, Simon Chapman, Bob Moody, Michael Moore from Public Health Association of Australia, and Tom Calmer. We also had a written media strategy, worked very hard to make sure we got good coverage. And I'll just give some examples of what outcomes were there. So in fact, from the media point of view, although it does say it on the packet, we had over 900 media articles from the paper and a lot of national and international interest. And we're actually going to be monitoring the impact of the findings over time, but there really was a lot of media interest, and we're hoping that just that release in itself may have helped some people to quit. We also had KASHA, a coalition of anti-smoking groups, non-government and government organisations, put out this one-page ad in the Western Australian the day after the paper, so direct to information for smokers. And the other thing that happened was I've been getting reports of a number of different ways in which the data have been used. So this is one example. This is Bronwyn King, who's a radiation oncologist, and in her day-to-day work, she had a lot of people with smoking-related cancers that she was treating. She was horrified to find that her hospital super fund was actually investing in tobacco. So she approached that super fund to suggest that they divest, and from that she's gone on to convince 28 different Australian super funds to divest at least 1.3 billion from tobacco companies. And she said to me, well, I quote your paper daily because it's great to have Australian data to say, well, this is doing harm to the Australian community. So I shall just go backwards. Sorry. The other thing I've heard since then, so I've been talking quite a lot to people from different tobacco control organisations, and certainly within the Commonwealth Health Department, within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, but also within the non-government organisations, so the Joint Tobacco Control Committee of Cancer Council and Heart Foundation. All of those groups have said, well, when the findings came out, we reviewed them for their credibility. We now adopt them as the data that we base our work on. And when I talked to one of the Quitline people and said, oh, Bronwyn King says she uses the findings every day, she said, well, I can beat that. I use them 20 times a day because I use them every time I talk to someone on the Quitline who's thinking of quitting. So it's only been about 8 months since 8 or 9 months since the paper was released. But what we've seen then is really quite comprehensive uptake from the sort of ministerial speeches in the health department all the way through to the front line from the Quitline. So I think what really struck me is that tobacco control in Australia is so state-of-the-art and so well organised that they had multiple places to really take up this evidence. And prior to the release of these findings, we were really relying on a sort of summary of the worldwide evidence. We didn't have direct evidence from Australia, so it really was almost like a hunger, a policy hunger for direct data. So I'm also very happy to report that during the last few months, my university has gone smoke-free. Maybe your organisations were already completely smoke-free. We've been smoke-free inside buildings, but this is actually the whole campus of ANU is now smoke-free, and I think this picture of the lovely clear autumnal days really shows just how clear the air can be if you go smoke-free. So I'd like to conclude this presentation, and I don't know how these webinars work, whether there's time for questions or whether we're set up for questions. But anyway, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the participants in the study. It really is quite an amazing thing to have the people, one by one report on their questionnaire what their experiences are, and then to really be able to use those data to feed back to those participants about the health effects of what they're exposed to. I'd also like to thank the other authors on the paper who are listed there, and to the 45 and up study management team, but also the people who support the 45 and up study infrastructure, particularly Cancer Council New South Wales, which is the major partner, and the National Heart Foundation. This project was funded by the Heart Foundation, and I'm funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia and also the ANU. And I'd particularly like to have a vote of thanks to the ANU, because this time of research you can't really get funded through a grant, because people will say, well, it says it on the packet. So I'd like to conclude my talk there. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me on emily.banks@anu.edu.au.